Part 5, Chapter 11. Tearing at the Chains. The middle ground is now collapsed. The ditch which ran between us and our custodians was now a deep moat, and we stood on opposite slopes, taking measure of the situation. Stood is, of course, a manner of speaking. We went to work daily. We were never late for work line-up. We never let each other down. There were no shirkers. We chalked up a good day's work. You might think that our masters could be pleased with us. All the same, we and they were thinking hard about the next stage. Things could not remain as they were. We could not be satisfied with what had happened, nor could they. Someone had to strike a blow. But what should be our aim? We could now say out loud, without looking nervously around, whatever we liked, all those things which had seethed inside us, and freedom of speech, even if it was only there in camp, even though it had come so late, was a delight. But could we hope to spread that freedom beyond camp, or carry it out with us? Of course not. We, from where we were, could not demand that the country should change completely, nor that it should give up the camps. They would have rained bombs on us. As to whether we should fight for an 8-hour working day, there was no unanimity among us. We were so unused to freedom that we seemed to have lost all appetite for it. Ways and means were also discussed. How should we present our demands? What actions should we take? Clearly, we could do nothing with bare hands against modern arms, and therefore the course for us to take was not armed rebellion, but a strike. But the blood in our veins was still slavish, still servile. The word strike sounded so terrifying to our ears that we sought firmer ground. By refusing food when we refused to work, it seemed to us that our moral right to strike would be reinforced. We felt that we had some sort of right to go on a hunger strike, but to strike in the ordinary sense? So that by voluntarily undertaking an unnecessary hunger strike, we voluntarily agreed to undermine the physical strength which we needed for the struggle. Fortunately, no other camp seems to have repeated Echabastez's mistake. We went over and over the details of the proposed work stoppage hunger strike. It was talked over in various places, in one group and another. It seemed inevitable and desirable, yet, because it was so novel, somehow impossible. But our custodians were less likely to lose by acting than by failing to act, and they got their blow in first. After that, events took on a momentum of their own. At peace and ease on our familiar bunks, in our familiar sections, we greeted the new year, 1952. Then on Sunday, January 6th, the Orthodox Christmas Eve, when the Ukrainians were getting ready to observe the holiday in style, they would make kutia, fast till the first star appeared, and then sing carols. The doors were locked after morning inspection, and not opened again. So that was it, a regrouping. Guards were posted by the break in the Chinese wall. It would be bricked up by next day. We were taken past the guardhouse and herded, hundreds of us, with sacks and mattresses like refugees from a burning village, around the boundary fence, past another guardhouse, into the other camp area, passing those who were being driven in the opposite direction. In one half of the camp, Camp Division Number 2, only the Ukrainian nationalists, some 2,000 of them, were left. In the half to which we had been driven, which was to be Camp Division Number 1, there were some 3,500 men belonging to all the other ethnic groups: Russians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Tatars, Caucasians, Georgians, Armenians, Jews, Poles, Moldavians, Germans, and a variegated sprinkling of other nationalities. The Ukrainians, Banderists, the most dangerous rebels, had been moved farther away from it. What did this mean? We soon learned what. Reliable rumors went around camp, from the working prisoners who took the gruel to the BUR, that the stoolies in the safe deposit had grown cheeky. Suspects, picked up here and there, 2 or 3 at a time, had been put in with the stoolies, who were torturing them in their common cell, choking them, beating them, trying to make them sing, and to name names. "Who is doing the slashing?" This made the whole scheme as clear as daylight. They were using torture. Not the dog pack themselves. They probably had no authorization for it, and might run into trouble, so they had entrusted the stoolies with the job. Find your murderers yourselves. So many deep historians have written so many clever books, and still they have not learned how to predict those mysterious conflagrations of the human spirit, to detect the mysterious springs of a social explosion, nor even to explain them in retrospect. Sometimes you can stuff bundle after bundle of burning tow under the logs, and they will not take. Yet up above, a solitary little spark flies out from the chimney, and the whole village is reduced to ashes. Our 3,000 had no plans made, were quite unprepared, but one evening on their return from work, the prisoners in a hut next to the BUR began dismantling their bunks, seizing the long bars and cross pieces, ran through the gloom to batter down the stout fence around the camp jail. They had neither axes nor crowbars. There was a hammering noise. They worked like a team of good carpenters, levering the planks away as soon as they gave, and the grating protests of 12-centimeter nails could be heard all over the camp. The warders hustled over to the BUR, to the half-dark wall where all the activity was, and raced like scalded cats to the staff barracks. Somebody rushed over a warder with a stick. Then, to provide full musical accompaniment, somebody started breaking windows in the staff barracks with stones or a stick. The staff's window panes shattered with a merry menacing crash. What the lads had in mind was not to raise a rebellion, nor even to capture the BUR, no easy matter, but merely to pour petrol into the stoolie's cell and toss in something burning, meaning, watch your step, we'll show you yet. But machine gun fire from the towers suddenly rattled across the camp, and they never did start their blaze. The warders and the chief disciplinary officer, Machakovsky, had fled from the camp and informed Division. Division gave telephonic instructions for the corner towers to open fire from machine guns on 3,000 unarmed people who knew nothing of what had happened. Our team, for instance, was in the mess hall and were completely mystified when we heard all the shooting outside. Firing at random in the darkness, the machine gunners blasted away. They pierced the flimsy walls of the huts and, as always happens, wounded not those who had stormed the BUR, but others who had no part in it. In hut number 9, a harmless old man nearing the end of a 10-year sentence was killed in his bed. He was due to be released in a month's time. The besiegers left the prison yard and quickly dispersed to their barracks, where they had to put their bunks together again so as to cover their traces. Many others took the shouting as a warning to stay inside their huts, yet others, on the contrary, poured out excitedly and scurried about the camp, trying to understand what it was all about. By then there were no warders left in the camp area. The staff barracks was empty of officers, and terrible jagged holes yawned in its windows. The towers were silent. The curious and the seekers after truth roamed the camp. Suddenly the gates of our camp division were flung wide, and a platoon of convoy troops marched in with Tommy guns at the ready, firing short bursts at random. They fanned out in all directions, and behind them came the enraged warders, with links of iron pipe, clubs, or anything else they had been able to lay their hands on. A lethal crush developed at the entrance to our hut. The prisoners were so anxious to shove their way in that no one could enter. Not that the thin boards of the hut walls gave any protection against bullets, but once inside, a man ceased to be a mutineer. I was one of those by the steps. I remember very well my state of mind, a nauseated indifference to my fate, a momentary indifference whether I survived or not. Why have you fastened your hooks on us, curse you? Why must we go on paying you till the day we die for the crime of being born into this unhappy world? Why must we sit forever in your jails? The prison sickness, which is at once nausea and peace of mind, flooded my being. Even my constant fear for the as yet unrecorded poem and the play I carried within me was in abeyance. In full view of the death which was wheeling toward us in military greatcoats, I made no effort at all to push through the door. This was the true convict mentality. This is what they had brought us to. Our pursuers did not break into the huts. They locked us in, They hunted down and beat those who had not been quick enough to run inside. The work stoppage hunger strike had not been carefully prepared. It was not even a coherent concept, and it began impulsively, with no directing center, no signal system. Those prisoners in other camps who took over the food stores and then stayed away from work, of course, behaved more sensibly. But our action, if not very clever, was impressive. 3,000 men simultaneously swore off both food and work. Next morning, not a single team sent its man to the bread-cutting room. Not a single team went to the mess hall, where broth and mush awaited them. The warders just could not understand it. Twice, 3 times, 4 times, they came into the huts to summon us with brisk commands, then to drive us out with threats, then to ask us nicely. No farther than to the mess hall to collect our bread, with never a word for the present about work line-up. But nobody went. They all lay on their bunks, fully dressed, wearing their shoes, and silent. Only we, the foremen, I had become a foreman in that hot year, felt called upon to answer, since the warders kept addressing themselves to us. We lay on our bunks like the rest and muttered from our pillows, "It's no good, boss." This unanimous, quiet defiance of a power which never forgave, this obstinate, painfully protracted insubordination, was somehow more frightening than running and yelling as bullets fly. In the end, they stopped coaxing us and locked up the huts. In the days that followed, no one left in the huts except the orderlies to carry the latrine buckets out and bring drinking water and coal in. Only bed cases in the medical section were by general agreement allowed not to fast. The bosses could no longer see us, no longer peer into our souls. A gulf had opened up between the overseers and the slaves. None of those who took part will ever forget those 3 days in our lives. We could not see our comrades in other huts, nor the corpses lying there unburied. Nonetheless, the bonds which united us at the opposite ends of the deserted camp were of steel. This was a hunger strike called not by well-fed people with reserves of subcutaneous fat, but by gaunt, emaciated men who had felt the whip of hunger daily for years on end, who had achieved with difficulty some sort of physical equilibrium, and who suffered acute distress if they were deprived of a single 100-gram ration. Even the goners starved with the rest, although a 3-day fast might tip them into irreversible and fatal decline. The food which we had refused, and which we had always thought so beggarly, was a mirage of plenty in the feverish dreams of famished men. This was a hunger strike called by men schooled for decades in the law of the jungle. You die first, and I'll die later. Now they were reborn. They struggled out of their stinking swamp. They consented to die today, all of them together, rather than go on living in the same way tomorrow. In the huts, roommates began to treat each other with a sort of ceremonious affection. Whatever scraps of food anyone, this meant mainly those who received parcels, had left were pooled, placed on a piece of rag spread out like a tablecloth, and then, by joint decision of the whole room, some eatables were shared out and others put aside for the next day. What the bosses would do, no one could predict. We thought that perhaps they would start firing on the huts again from the towers. The last thing we expected was any concession. We had never in our lives wrested anything from them, and our strike had the bitter tang of hopelessness. But there was a sort of satisfaction in this feeling of hopelessness. We had taken a futile, a desperate step. It could only end badly, and that was good. Our bellies were empty, our hearts were in our boots, but some higher need was being satisfied. During those long, hungry days, evenings, nights, 3,000 men brooded over their 3,000 sentences, their families, their lack of families, all that had befallen and would yet befall them. And although the hearts in thousands of breasts could not beat together, and there were those who felt only regret, only despair, yet most of them kept time. Things are as they should be. We'll keep it up to spite you. Things are bad. So much the better. This, too, is a phenomenon which has never been adequately studied. We do not know the law that governs sudden surges of mass emotion in defiance of all reason. I felt this soaring emotion myself. I had only 1 more year of my sentence to serve. I might have been expected to feel nothing but dismay and vexation that I was dirtying my hands on a broil which I could hardly escape without a new sentence. And yet I had no regrets. Damn and blast the lot of you. I'll serve my time all over again if you like. Next day we saw from our windows a group of officers making their way from hut to hut. A detail of warders opened the door, went along the corridors, looked into the rooms, and called us, not in the old way, as though we were cattle, but gently. "Foreman, you're wanted at the entrance." A debate began among us. It was the teams, not their foreman, who had to decide. Men went from room to room to talk it over. A decision was reached at last in some invisible quarter. We foremen, 6 or 7 of us, went out to the entrance, where the officers were patiently awaiting us. We lowered our eyes because not one of us could now look at our bosses sycophantically, and rebellious looks would have been foolish. From both corridors, however, a crowd of Zeks pressed into the entranceway, and hiding behind those in front, the back rows could speak freely, call out our demands and our answers. Officially, the officers with the blue-edged epaulets, some we knew, others we had never seen before, saw and addressed only the foreman. Their manner was restrained. They did not try to intimidate us, but their tone was still intended to remind us that we were inferior. It would, so they said, be in our own interest to end the strike and the hunger strike. If we did, we would receive not only today's rations, but, something unheard of in Gulag, yesterday's, too. They were so used to the idea that hungry men can always be bought. There were shouts from the corridor. "Whoever's to blame for the shooting must be brought to justice. Take the locks off the doors. Off with the numbers." The bosses left, and the hut was locked up again. Although the hunger had begun to get many of us down, our heads were heavy and our thoughts lacked clarity, in our hut not a single voice was raised in favor of surrender. For the second night, the third morning, and the third day, hunger clawed at our guts. But then on the third morning, the Chekists, in still greater force, again summoned the foreman to the entrance, and once again we stood there, sullen, unreachable, hangdog. Our general resolve was not to give way. We were carried along by inertial force. The bosses only gave us new strength. The newly arrived brass hat had this to say: "The administration of the Pesheni camp requests the prisoners to take their food. The administration will receive any complaints. It will examine them and eliminate the causes of conflict between the administration and the prisoners." Had our ears deceived us? They were requesting us to take food, and not so much as a word about work. We had stormed the camp jail, broken windows and lamps, chased warders with knives, and it now turned out that far from being a mutiny, this was a conflict between equals, between the administration and the prisoners. It had only taken 2 days and 2 nights of united action, and look how our serf masters had changed their tone. Never in our lives, not only as prisoners, but as free men, as members of trade unions, had we heard our bosses speak with such unction. Nonetheless, we started silently dispersing. No one could take a decision there, nor could anyone there promise a decision. The hut was locked again. From outside it looked to the bosses as dumb and unyielding as ever, but inside the sections were the scene of a stormy debate. The temptation was too great. Soft speech had affected the undemanding Zeks more than any threat would. Voices were heard urging surrender. What more, indeed, could we hope to achieve? We were tired. We were hungry. The mysterious force which had fused our emotions and borne us aloft was losing height, and with tremulous wings bringing us down to earth again. Yet mouths clamped tight for decades, mouths which had been silent for a lifetime, were now opened. Give way now? That would mean accepting someone's word of honor. Whose word exactly? That of our jailers, the camp dog pack. In all the time that prisons had existed, in all the time the camps had been there, had they ever once kept their word? The sentiment of ancient sufferings and wrongs and insults was stirred up anew. For the first time ever we had taken the right road. Were we to give in so soon? For the first time we had felt what it was like to be human, only to give in so quickly. A keen, brazen breeze of mischief blew around us. We would go on, we would go on. They'd sing a different tune before we finished. They would give way. Once more the emotions of 200 men were fused in a single passion. The wings of an eagle beat the air. He sailed aloft. We lay down to conserve our strength, trying to move as little as possible and not to talk unnecessarily. Our thoughts were quite enough to occupy us. Suddenly, in the late afternoon of the third day, when the western sky was clearing and the setting sun could be seen, our observers shouted in anger and dismay, "Hut 9! 9 has surrendered! 9's going to the mess hall!" We all jumped up. Prisoners from the other side of the corridor ran into our room. Through the bars, from the upper and lower bed platforms, some of us on all fours, some looking over other people's shoulders, we watched, transfixed, that sad procession. 250 pathetic little figures, darker than ever against the sunset, cowed and crestfallen, were trailing slantwise across the camp. On they went, each of them glimpsed briefly in the rays of the setting sun, a dawdling, endless chain, as though those behind regretted that the foreman had set out, and were loath to follow. Some, feebler than the rest, were led by the arm or the hand, and so uncertain were their steps that they looked like blind men with their guides. Many, too, held mess tins or mugs in their hands, and this mean prison ware, carried in expectation of a supper too copious to gulp down onto constricted stomachs, these tins and cups held out like begging bowls, were more degrading and slavish and pitiable than anything else about them. I felt myself weeping. I glanced at my companions as I wiped away my tears, and saw theirs. Hut number 9 had spoken and decided for us all. It was there that the dead had been lying around for 4 days, since Tuesday evening. They went into the mess hall, and it was as though they had decided to forgive the murderers in return for their bread ration and some mush. We went away from the windows without a word. It was then that I learned the meaning of Polish pride, and understood their recklessly brave rebellions. The Polish engineer Jerzy Wagurski, whom I have mentioned before, was now in our team. He was serving his 9th and last year. Even when he was a work assigner, no one had ever heard him raise his voice. He was always quiet, polite, and gentle. But now, his face was distorted with rage, scorn, and suffering, as he tore his eyes away from that procession of beggars and cried in an angry, steely voice, "Foreman! Don't wake me for supper. I shan't be going." He clambered up onto the top bunk, turned his face to the wall, and didn't get up again. That night we went to eat, but he wouldn't get up. He never received parcels. He was quite alone. He was always short of food, but he wouldn't get up. In his mind's eye, the steam from a bowl of mush could not veil the ideal of freedom. If we had all been so proud and so strong, what tyrant could have held out against us? But what had happened had not gone for nothing, and our comrades had not fallen in vain. The atmosphere in the camp would never be as oppressive as before. Meanness was back on its throne, but very precariously. Politics were freely discussed in the huts. No work assigner or foreman would dare kick a Zek or take a swing at him, because everybody knew how easy it is to make knives and how easily they sink home between the ribs. Our little island had experienced an earthquake and ceased to belong to the archipelago. This was how Ekibastas felt. It is doubtful whether Karaganda felt the same, and certain that Moscow did not. The special camp system was beginning to collapse in one place after another, but our father and teacher had no inkling of it. Meanwhile, the germ of freedom was spreading. Like a legend in chains, our movement entered still servile Kengir to awaken it, too. There were other disturbances besides ours, besides those in the special camps, but the whole bloody past had been so carefully cleaned up and painted and polished that it was impossible for me to now establish even a bare list of disorders in the camps. Evidently, the Stalinist camp system, particularly the special camps, was nearing a crisis at the beginning of the 50s. Even in the Almighty One's lifetime, the natives were beginning to tear at their chains. There is no knowing how things would have gone if he had lived. As it was, for reasons which had nothing to do with the laws of economics or society, the sluggish and impure blood suddenly stopped flowing in the senile veins of that undersized and pockmarked individual. However, the tyrant did not die in vain. Something hidden from view slipped and shifted, and suddenly, with a tinny clatter like an empty bucket falling, yet another individual came tumbling headlong from the very top of the ladder into the muckiest of bogs. And now everyone, the vanguard, the rear, even the most wretched natives of Gulag, realized that a new age had arrived. To us on the archipelago, Beria's fall was like a thunderclap. He was the supreme patron, the viceroy of the archipelago. MVD officers were perplexed, embarrassed, dismayed. "It's all over now," Colonel Chekhov said with quivering lips. But he was mistaken. End of Part 5, Chapter 11.